God works miracles in your life every day. What if the greatest frustration you feel right now is not because God is absent, but because you expected him to act in a way he never promised he would? Think about this carefully. How many times have you prayed, waited, hoped for a clear answer, a visible sign, something undeniable, and instead, what you received was silence, or at least what felt like silence. And slowly, without even realizing it, something began to grow inside you. A quiet doubt, a subtle question. Is God really listening to me? But what if that question is built on a misunderstanding? Because the truth is, God rarely works according to human expectations. While we look for the extraordinary, he often moves in the ordinary. While we wait for something dramatic, he is already acting in ways that require attention, not spectacle. And this is where many people lose sight of what God is actually doing in their lives. The danger is not that God stops working. The danger is that we stop recognizing. There are prayers you thought were ignored that were actually answered through protection. There are paths you wanted that were closed, not as rejection, but as rescue. There are moments when you felt alone, yet something sustained you in a way you cannot fully explain. That was not coincidence. That was not luck. So here is the real question. What if God has been working in your life every single day and you just didn't recognize it? Because once you begin to see it, everything changes. Your faith changes. Your perspective changes. Even your pain begins to take on a different meaning. And what we are about to uncover may challenge the way you have been looking at your own life until now. The illusion of a silent God. There is a kind of pain that does not come from tragedy alone. It comes from waiting. It comes from praying with sincerity, asking God for help, for direction, for relief, and then looking around and seeing no visible change. The problem is not only the difficulty itself. The problem is what begins to happen inside the heart when the difficulty remains and heaven seems quiet. Little by little, a person can begin to believe that God is far away, uninterested, or unwilling to respond. And that is how the illusion begins. Not because God has actually withdrawn, but because human weakness can turn divine silence into a story that is not true. Most people do not wake up one morning and decide to doubt God. Doubt usually forms in silence. It forms in repeated disappointment, in long nights of mental exhaustion, in prayers whispered through tears that seem to be followed by nothing. It forms when someone believed life would improve, but the pressure continued. When they thought a door would open, but it stayed shut. When they begged for clarity, but confusion remained. In those moments, the heart starts searching for an explanation, and one of the easiest explanations is this: God is silent. God is not moving. God is not answering me. But that conclusion often says more about human expectation than about God's actual activity. We tend to imagine that if God is working, it should be obvious. We expect quick relief, immediate breakthroughs, dramatic reversals, unmistakable signs. We want the kind of answer that leaves no room for uncertainty. We want to point to a moment and say, there it is. That is what God did. But God does not always reveal his work in ways that satisfy human impatience. Very often, he works beneath the surface, in timing, in restraint, in prevention, in inner strengthening, in hidden alignment, in processes that only become clear after they have already carried us through. That is where spiritual confusion becomes dangerous. If you only define God's action by what is sudden and visible, then you may completely miss what he is doing through endurance, redirection, and preservation. You may call it silence when, in reality, God is sustaining you in ways you have not yet learned to honor. You may call it absence when he is actually keeping you from collapsing. You may call it delay when he is shaping something deeper than the answer you originally asked for. This is why emotional pain must be handled carefully. Pain changes perception. When a person is wounded, Even love can feel distant. When a person is exhausted, even faith can feel heavy. When someone has been carrying too much for too long, they stop seeing clearly. They do not only struggle with their circumstances, they begin to struggle with meaning. They begin to interpret everything through disappointment. A closed door feels like rejection. A delay feels like neglect. A season of uncertainty feels like abandonment. But not every closed door is punishment. Not every delay is denial. Not every silence is distance. Sometimes silence is where God does his deepest work. The problem is that we are often more comfortable with a God who explains everything quickly than with a God who asks us to trust while we cannot yet see. But trust is not built when everything is obvious. Trust is built when the heart chooses to believe that God is still present even when the evidence is incomplete. That is what makes this struggle so spiritual. It is not only about circumstances, it is about interpretation. It is about whether you will define God by what you feel in one painful moment, or whether you will anchor yourself in who he has always been. Scripture repeatedly shows that God's people experienced seasons where he seemed hidden. There were moments of waiting, wilderness, captivity, confusion, and unanswered cries. Yet the deeper truth was always the same. What felt like silence was never proof of divine abandonment. God was still leading, still preserving, still preparing, still unfolding his purposes in time. The silence was real as a human experience, but it was not the full reality. That distinction matters, because if you confuse your emotional experience with the full truth of what God is doing, you can begin to build your faith around appearances instead of around his character. And this is where many people quietly lose strength, not because God failed them, but because they judged his faithfulness only by what they could immediately understand. They stopped looking for his hand in the hidden places. They stopped recognizing the grace that kept them standing. They overlooked the fact that they survived things that should have broken them. They ignored the unseen mercy in what did not happen. They forgot that even the desire to keep praying in a hard season can itself be evidence that God has not let go of them. The illusion of a silent God becomes powerful when a person believes that lack of visible movement means lack of divine involvement. But that is not always true. A seed beneath the soil looks inactive before it breaks through. A life being redirected can feel delayed before it makes sense. A heart being transformed often feels confused before it becomes clear. God's work is not always loud at the moment it is happening. Many times it is only recognized later when the person looks back and realizes that what seemed still was never empty. What seemed silent was never abandoned. What seemed delayed was never forgotten. So the question is not only whether you have gone through a season where God felt silent. The deeper question is this: what have you concluded about God in that silence? Because if your conclusion was shaped by pain alone, there is a real chance that you have mistaken hidden activity for absence. And if that is true, then your story may not be one of divine silence at all. It may be the story of a God who was working so deeply, so quietly, and so faithfully that you did not yet have the eyes to recognize him. When miracles don't look like miracles. One of the greatest reasons people fail to recognize the work of God is because they have already decided what a miracle is supposed to look like. In the imagination of many believers, a miracle must be immediate, undeniable, dramatic, and extraordinary. It must interrupt the normal order of life in such a visible way that no one could question it. And while God can certainly act like that, the problem begins when people reduce his power to only those kinds of moments. When that happens, they become blind to a form of divine action that is quieter, closer, and often more constant than they realize. Many people are waiting for the kind of miracle that can be described in one sentence, a healing that happened overnight. a financial breakthrough that arrived at the perfect moment, a door that opened in a way that felt unmistakably supernatural. They are looking for the event that can be pointed to with certainty. But what they often miss is that God also works through process, through timing, through gradual restoration, through unexpected restraint, and through small shifts that only reveal their weight later. The miracle did not fail to happen. It simply arrived in a form that did not match the picture they had already created in their minds. This is why some of the greatest works of God are dismissed as ordinary. A person avoids a path that later would have harmed them, and they call it coincidence. A conversation happens on the exact day their soul was close to giving up, and they call it timing. A burden that felt unbearable somehow does not crush them, and they call it resilience. Their mind searches for a natural explanation because the hand of God did not appear in the dramatic way they expected. But the existence of a natural path does not cancel the possibility of divine involvement. God is fully able to work through what appears ordinary to human eyes. In fact, part of his wisdom is precisely this. He does not always need to break the structure of life to reveal his power. Sometimes he reveals his power by sustaining life, preserving life, redirecting life, and entering its most common moments with uncommon purpose. And because people are often trained to honor only what shocks them, they fail to bow before what quietly carried them. Think about how many times you have called something small that actually changed everything. A delay that frustrated you but kept you from entering something destructive. A loss that wounded you but forced you to leave behind an illusion. A closed relationship, a cancelled plan, a season of discomfort, a painful redirection. At the time, none of it felt miraculous. It felt disappointing, unfair, or confusing. Yet later, with clearer eyes, you began to understand that what hurt you was also protecting you. What resisted you was also guiding you. What seemed like silence was also mercy. This is one of the deepest lessons of faith. Not every miracle arrives with celebration at first. Some miracles arrive disguised as interruption. Some arrive as limitation. Some arrive as a deep inner strengthening that no one else can see. Some arrive as peace when your circumstances have not changed yet. And that peace is not something to treat lightly. In a world where anxiety multiplies quickly and fear spreads easily, a heart kept steady in the middle of pressure is not a small thing. It is evidence that heaven has touched something within you. The problem is that many people honor outcomes more than presence. They call it a miracle only if they got what they wanted. But what if God's miracle was not always to give you what you asked for? What if the miracle was keeping you from becoming bitter while you waited? What if the miracle was giving you strength not to collapse? What if the miracle was preserving your mind in a season that should have destroyed your peace? What if the miracle was that you are still standing, still breathing, still seeking Him, even after everything that tried to break you? That kind of miracle is easy to overlook because it does not always impress other people. It does not always produce applause. It cannot always be photographed, explained, or publicly celebrated. But its value is enormous. There are invisible rescues that only eternity may fully reveal. There are dangers God prevented that you never saw. There are spiritual battles you did not even know were happening. There are moments where one subtle redirection altered the course of your life more than one dramatic event ever could. People often think that if a miracle is real, it must remove struggle. But many times, God's work is not to remove the struggle instantly. It is to enter it with you, preserve your soul through it, and bring fruit out of what should have only produced pain. That is why miracles cannot be measured only by visible comfort. Sometimes the deeper miracle is transformation. A proud heart becomes humble. A fearful person becomes steadfast. A wounded soul becomes compassionate. A distracted life becomes surrendered. These changes are not accidents. They are signs that God has been at work in places no human hand could reach, and that is why spiritual maturity changes the way a person looks at life. A mature believer does not ask only, "Where is the dramatic sign?" They also ask, "Where is God preserving me, correcting me, guiding me, sustaining me, restraining me, and opening my eyes?" Because once you understand that miracles do not always look like miracles, your whole life begins to feel different. You stop separating the sacred from the ordinary so aggressively. You stop imagining that God only appears in moments that feel supernatural to your emotions. You begin to realize that his fingerprints may be on the very things you once dismissed too quickly. What if the miracle was not only the door that opened, but also the one that closed? What if it was not only the blessing that arrived, but the temptation that lost its power? What if it was not only the visible answer, but the invisible protection? What if it was not only the sudden breakthrough, but the quiet grace that held you together one more day? If that is true, then many of the miracles of your life have not been absent. They have simply been misnamed. And once you begin to understand that, another question begins to rise with greater force. If God can work through ordinary moments, subtle timing, and hidden protection, then how often has he been speaking through the details of your daily life without you noticing? The hidden language of God in daily life. There is a way God moves that does not depend on loud signs or visible interruptions. It is not chaotic, it is not random, and it is not disconnected. It follows a kind of order, a kind of rhythm, a kind of language that is not spoken with words, but revealed through timing, patterns, and moments that align in ways too precise to ignore. The problem is that most people are not trained to recognize this language. They are waiting for something obvious, while God is already communicating through something subtle. You have probably experienced moments in your life that felt strangely aligned, not dramatic enough to call a miracle, but too intentional to call an accident. A thought that came at the exact moment you needed clarity. A conversation that happened on the day you were most discouraged. A delay that seemed frustrating at first, but later proved necessary. These are not always coincidences. Sometimes they are part of a divine pattern that only becomes visible when you look beyond the surface. But here is where things become more complex. The human mind is quick to explain everything in natural terms. It searches for logic, for cause and effect, for predictable explanations. And while logic has its place, it can also limit perception. Because not everything God does will fit into a simple, immediate explanation. Sometimes his work is revealed not through a single event, but through a sequence. Not through one moment, but through a chain of moments that, when connected, reveal intention. The difficulty is that you are living inside the sequence, not outside of it. You are experiencing one piece at a time, and because you cannot yet see the full picture, it is easy to assume that nothing meaningful is happening. But later, when enough time has passed, you look back and suddenly things begin to connect. You realize that what seemed isolated was actually linked. What felt random was actually guided. What looked like coincidence was part of something being carefully arranged. This is one of the ways God speaks without speaking directly. Not through audible words, but through alignment, through doors that open and close in ways that steer your path, through people who enter and leave your life at specific moments, through opportunities that appear just when something inside you has changed enough to recognize them, through interruptions that prevent you from moving in a direction that would have led to harm. And yet, even with all of this, many people remain unaware. Not because God is not communicating, but because their attention is divided. Modern life trains the mind to move quickly, to jump from one concern to another, to focus on what is urgent rather than what is meaningful. And in that constant movement, subtle patterns are easily missed. A person can live through moments filled with purpose and never stop long enough to notice them. Spiritual awareness requires something different. It requires stillness. It requires reflection. It requires the willingness to pause and ask deeper questions. Not only what is happening to me, but also what could God be doing through this? Not only why did this situation occur, but also how is this shaping me, redirecting me, or revealing something I would not have seen otherwise? Because when you begin to ask those questions, something changes. You start to notice things you ignored before. You start to see connections where you once saw randomness. You begin to perceive that your life is not unfolding in isolation, but within a framework of meaning that you are only beginning to understand. This does not mean that every event is easy to interpret. It does not mean that every situation will make sense immediately. There are moments that remain confusing, painful, and unclear. But even in those moments, the possibility remains that God is present in ways that are not yet visible. And that possibility alone can shift the way you endure what you do not yet understand. The hidden language of God is not meant to overwhelm you. It is meant to invite you into a deeper awareness, a more attentive way of living, a more sensitive way of perceiving. It is not about trying to force meaning into everything, but about becoming open to the idea that your life may be more guided than you once believed. And once that awareness begins to grow, something else becomes impossible to ignore. If God can communicate through patterns, timing, and subtle alignment, then it also means that what you have been calling unanswered prayers may actually be answers that arrived in a form you did not expect. Why your prayers are being answered differently than you expected. There is something deeply human about the way we pray. We ask God for specific outcomes, specific solutions, specific changes. We imagine what the answer should look like, how it should arrive, and how quickly it should happen. And without realizing it, we begin to measure God's faithfulness based on how closely reality matches that expectation. If things unfold the way we hoped, we call it an answer. If they don't, we begin to question whether God responded at all. But what if the issue is not that your prayers are being ignored, but that they are being answered in a way that goes beyond what you asked? Because when you pray, you are not speaking to a limited perspective. You are speaking to a God who sees the full picture. He sees consequences you cannot foresee, paths you cannot yet understand, outcomes that extend far beyond the present moment. And because of that, His answers are not always shaped by your request alone. They are shaped by purpose, by protection, by transformation, and by a timeline that is not restricted to your urgency. This is where tension begins. You ask for something good, something that seems right, something that makes sense to you. And instead of receiving it, you experience resistance. A door closes, a plan falls apart, a delay stretches longer than expected. And in that moment, it feels like a contradiction. How could something that seemed so right not be granted? Why would God allow this path to collapse? But there is a possibility that changes everything. What if what you asked for was not wrong, but it was incomplete? You asked for relief, but God saw the need for growth. You asked for an open door, but God saw a hidden danger. You asked for speed, but God saw that something inside you was not ready yet. You asked for a specific outcome, but God saw a deeper purpose that could not be fulfilled through that path. And because He sees what you cannot see, His answer may come in a form that initially feels like denial, but is actually direction. This is one of the hardest truths to accept because it requires trust at a level that goes beyond emotion. It requires you to believe that God's understanding is not only greater than yours, but also better aligned with what will truly sustain you. It requires you to release the idea that every good prayer must result in the exact outcome you imagined, because sometimes the answer to your prayer is not the removal of the struggle, but the strength to endure it. Sometimes it is not the opening of a door, but the clarity to walk away from it. Sometimes it is not the immediate solution, but a process that reshapes your character, your priorities, and your dependence on God. And here is where many people become discouraged. They interpret a different answer as no answer. They assume that because the outcome did not match their expectation, God must not have responded. But that assumption can lead to a dangerous blindness, because while they are waiting for one specific form of answer, they may be walking past the answer that has already begun to unfold. Think about how many times something did not happen the way you wanted, only for you to realize later that it was for your good. How many times a delay protected you? How many times a loss redirected you? How many times something you once insisted on became something you were later grateful to have avoided? At the moment, it did not feel like an answer. It felt like disappointment. But in time, it revealed itself as wisdom. This is the difference between immediate perception and deeper understanding. In the moment, you see only what is missing. Later, you begin to see what was given. God's answers are not always designed to satisfy your expectation. They are designed to fulfill His purpose in your life, and that purpose includes not only what you receive, but who you become. Because what would it mean to gain everything you asked for, but remain unprepared, unstable, or unchanged within yourself? So when your prayers are answered differently than you expected, it is not always a sign of distance. It may be a sign of precision, a sign that God is not only listening, but carefully responding in a way that aligns with something greater than your current understanding. And if that is true, then the real question begins to shift. Instead of asking why God did not give you what you asked for, you begin to ask something deeper. What is God doing through the way He answered? Because the moment you start asking that question, you stop seeing prayer as a transaction and you begin to see it as a relationship. A relationship where trust grows, where understanding deepens, and where even the answers you did not expect begin to reveal a kind of care you could not have planned on your own. Awakening your spiritual perception. There are people who pass through life surrounded by evidence of God's care and still feel as though they are walking alone. Not because God is absent and not because He has stopped working, but because spiritual perception has gone dormant. The eyes still see daily life, the mind still analyzes circumstances, the emotions still react to pressure, but the soul is no longer paying attention in the same way. And when that happens, even moments filled with grace can feel ordinary, empty, or meaningless. This is why spiritual perception is not a small subject. It changes the way a person interprets everything. Two people can walk through similar seasons and come out with completely different conclusions. One becomes more bitter, more numb, more convinced that life is random and God is distant. The other becomes more attentive, more grateful, more aware that even in difficulty there were traces of divine care. The difference is not always in the circumstances themselves. Very often, the difference is in what the heart has learned to notice. Spiritual perception does not awaken through noise. It awakens through surrender. It awakens when a person stops demanding that God fit inside their preferred way of acting and begins to ask for the humility to see Him as He truly is. That shift is powerful because it moves the soul out of control and into trust. It breaks the habit of looking only for dramatic intervention and opens the heart to recognize quiet faithfulness. It teaches you that God does not need to impress your senses in order to be present. He only needs to be Himself. But there is a reason many people struggle with this. A distracted life weakens perception. When the mind is always rushing, always consuming, always reacting, there is very little room left for discernment. A person can become spiritually dull without even noticing it. Not rebellious, not openly unbelieving, just dull. Too full of noise to reflect deeply, too exhausted to pay attention, too wounded to believe there could still be meaning hidden inside ordinary moments. And that dullness slowly becomes a lens, The person stops expecting to notice God, and so they stop looking. That is why gratitude is not just a positive attitude. It is a spiritual discipline. Gratitude trains the heart to recognize what pride and distraction overlook. It interrupts the constant search for what is missing and refocuses attention on what has been given. It does not deny pain. It does not pretend hardship is easy, but it refuses to let hardship become the only thing the soul can see. A grateful heart starts to notice provision, preservation, timing, strength, protection, and unexpected peace. It begins to understand that the God who did not remove every burden still carried the person through them. Stillness matters for the same reason, not because silence itself is magical, but because silence reveals what constant movement hides. There are truths that only surface when a person slows down enough to think honestly. How did I survive that season? Why did that closed door later make sense? Why did I meet that person at that exact time? Why did I feel restrained from going further in a direction that later proved dangerous? These are not always questions with instant answers, but they are often the beginning of awakening. Because once the soul starts reflecting, it begins to recover its sensitivity. Faith also changes perception, but not in a shallow way. Real faith is not pretending everything is obvious. It is choosing to believe that God's presence is not limited to what you can immediately explain. It is the decision to remain open to divine meaning even when circumstances feel unresolved. It is what keeps the heart from collapsing into cynicism. Without faith, a person will explain every form of grace as luck, every redirection as chance, every preservation as coincidence. With faith, the same person begins to see that life may be held together by more than visible causes alone. And this awakening is not only about recognizing miracles from the past. It changes how you walk through the present. You become less quick to despair, less eager to declare that nothing is happening, less likely to measure God's activity only by visible breakthroughs. You become more watchful, more anchored, more capable of seeing that divine care often arrives in forms the world would dismiss. That kind of awareness creates a deeper steadiness. It does not remove all uncertainty, but it keeps uncertainty from becoming blindness. There is also a painful truth hidden here. Some people do not lose wonder because life became too ordinary. They lose wonder because disappointment taught them to protect themselves from hope. They stopped expecting to see God because it felt safer than being let down again. And that self-protection can become a barrier. It keeps the person from being deceived, perhaps, but it also keeps them from being softened. It shuts the door, not only on false expectations, but on holy recognition. Awakening spiritual perception means letting God heal that defensive numbness. It means becoming willing once again to notice, to trust, to wonder, and to be moved. This kind of awakening does not happen all at once. It happens as the heart is retrained, as gratitude becomes natural, as stillness becomes less uncomfortable, as faith becomes more rooted in God's character than in immediate results. As the person begins to realize that the ordinary is not empty, that timing matters, that restraint can be mercy, that peace can be evidence, and that endurance itself may be a sign of grace. And when perception begins to awaken, something remarkable happens. The story of your life starts to look different. Moments you once called meaningless begin to glow with significance. Things you once dismissed too quickly begin to reveal their weight. You begin to understand that God may have been far closer, far more active, and far more faithful than your numbness allowed you to see. And once that realization begins to take hold, there is only one place left to go. Back through your own story with new eyes until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore, and you come face to face with a truth that changes everything. God never stopped working. The day you realize. God never stopped working. There comes a moment that cannot be forced, only discovered. It does not arrive with noise, and it does not depend on a single dramatic event. It comes quietly, almost unexpectedly, when you begin to look back at your own life with a different kind of attention. Not the attention of frustration, not the attention of what is still missing, but the attention of someone who is finally willing to see what has always been there. And suddenly things start to connect. You remember seasons that once felt unbearable, and yet you made it through. Not easily, not without scars, but you are still here. You remember moments when you felt like giving up, yet something inside you refused to collapse completely. You remember paths you wanted so badly that did not open, and now you can see where they would have led. You remember delays that once felt like punishment, but now look like protection. And without realizing it, a question begins to rise in a different way. What if I was never as alone as I thought? This realization does not come from denial of pain. It comes from a deeper understanding of it. You do not pretend that what you went through was easy. You do not rewrite your struggles as if they were comfortable. But you begin to see that within those struggles, there were elements you did not notice at the time. Strength that was not yours alone. Timing that did not depend only on your control. Preservation that cannot be fully explained by your own effort, and that is when the illusion begins to break. The belief that God was silent starts to lose its weight. The idea that nothing was happening begins to feel incomplete. Because when you trace your steps honestly, you start to recognize that there were too many moments where things aligned, too many instances where you were sustained, too many situations where something held you together when you should have fallen apart completely. It was not always visible in the moment. That is what makes this realization so powerful. You understand that God's work is not always designed to be fully recognized while it is happening. Sometimes it is only understood in reflection, when the distance between where you were and where you are becomes clear enough to reveal what was carrying you through. And this changes the way you see everything. You stop measuring God's presence only by what you feel in the present moment. You stop assuming that uncertainty means absence. You stop concluding too quickly that a lack of visible answers means a lack of response, because now you have evidence. Not theory, not someone else's testimony, but your own story. A story that, when examined with honesty, begins to show signs of guidance, protection, correction, and care that you did not fully recognize before. This is where faith deepens in a different way. It is no longer built only on expectation. It is built on recognition. You are not just hoping that God will act. You are remembering that He already has, and that memory changes the way you face what is ahead. It gives you a steadiness that is not dependent on immediate clarity. It allows you to move forward without needing to control every outcome, because you have seen that even when you did not understand, something greater was still at work. But there is also a responsibility that comes with this realization, because once you begin to see that God never stopped working, you can no longer live as if He is absent. You can no longer ignore the quiet ways He moves. You can no longer treat your life as if it is disconnected from His presence. Awareness brings accountability. It calls you to live with greater attention, greater gratitude, and greater trust. Not a superficial trust that disappears when things become difficult, but a rooted trust that has already been tested by your own history. And maybe this is the moment where everything shifts. Not because all your questions are answered, not because all your struggles disappear, but because your perspective is no longer the same. You begin to walk through life with the understanding that even when you cannot see clearly, you are not abandoned. Even when things feel uncertain, they are not uncontrolled. Even when answers seem delayed, something may already be unfolding in a way you will only understand later. So before you ask God for another sign, another miracle, another answer, pause for a moment and look back. Look carefully. Look honestly, because the evidence may already be there. And if you can see it even in part, then the conclusion becomes unavoidable. God did not stop working. You just did not see it yet.